Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Now, what happens when a powerful black executive boards a first-class flight and flips the script by playing the victim? And what if the one person he tries to break is the only one who finally says, no more? This isn't the story you think it is. Stay with us. It's about to get real. The morning had the kind of quiet that settles deep in your bones. Outside the crew entrance at Hartsfield-Jackson in Atlanta, the air was still, thick with early spring humidity and the sound of rolling suitcases on concrete. Sylvia Dorn adjusted the strap on her shoulder bag and took a slow breath before pushing through the security door. Her shift hadn't even started, but her mind was already in the cabin, already smoothing blankets and straightening trays in her head. She'd done this 100 times before, maybe more. Walk the hallway, badge in, nod to the agents who never quite remembered her name, and step into the narrow prep room where the day's flight crews moved like clock hands. And yet today, something tugged at her. Nothing loud or alarming, just a quiet reminder in the back of her mind that being good at your job didn't always mean you'd be respected for it. "Morning, Dorn," came a familiar voice. Liam Carraway, tall and always slightly leaning like he couldn't be bothered to stand up straight. His smile was lopsided in that warm, older brother way. "You're early, again." Sylvia gave a tired grin, dropping her bag onto the bench beside his. "Old habits. I like to walk through the cabin before we board. Makes it feel like mine for a minute." Liam chuckled. "Territorial. I like it." The prep room smelled like strong coffee and floor wax, and the overhead fluorescent lights cast everything in a flat, unflattering glow. Sylvia checked the wall monitor. Flight 914 to New York, on time. Clear skies. A good sign, though she never trusted early predictions. She took a minute to brush out her ponytail and repin her name tag. Small details maybe, but in her line of work, details mattered. You never knew who you'd be serving that day, or how closely they'd be watching. Liam leaned in a bit, more curious than concerned. "You okay?" Sylvia hesitated just a beat. "Yeah, just tired, I guess." "You ever feel like you're being tested even when nobody says it out loud?" Liam nodded, his eyes softer now. "Every flight." He didn't need to say more. That was one of the unspoken things they shared. He as a black man in a crisp navy blazer, she as a white woman with a face people assumed didn't know struggle. Both had been misunderstood in different ways, and both had learned to smile through it. As they moved toward the aircraft, Sylvia could feel herself shift gears. Her back straightened, her voice took on that calm, practiced tone. Passengers didn't want to see your fatigue. They wanted reassurance. They wanted someone who looked like they'd done this all their life, and Sylvia had. Inside the jet, she walked down the aisle of the first-class cabin with that familiar sense of possession. The leather seats gleamed, untouched. The air carried the scent of lemon disinfectant and recycled coolness. She ran a finger along the armrest of 1A and imagined the kind of person who might be sitting there today. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A missed call from Mom. Sylvia stared at it a moment, then tucked the phone away. Not now. There was never time when she was working, or at least, that's what she told herself. In her quietest moments, she sometimes wondered what it would take to feel truly seen. Not by passengers, not even by management, but by the world around her. She did the work. She showed up early. She wore the uniform like armor. Still, there were days when a look or a word could shrink her down to something smaller than she was. But not today. Today she had a flight to run, and until they hit the tarmac in New York, that cabin was hers to command. She glanced out the window. The sun had finally broken through the clouds, lighting the tarmac in soft gold. Liam appeared beside her with 2 coffees, one already halfway gone. "You ready?" he asked. Sylvia took the cup, nodded, and exhaled slowly. "Let's fly." Boarding had started like most flights did, orderly on the outside, messy underneath. Sylvia stood near the jet bridge, checking tickets with a smile that had just enough warmth to feel sincere, but not so much that it invited conversation. The regulars came through first, a young tech guy in a Patagonia vest, an elderly couple who held hands like they were still getting used to it. She greeted them with gentle nods, mentally placing them in the rows they'd occupy. She liked knowing where people sat. It helped her read the room. Then he arrived. Malcolm Rexton stepped into the doorway like it was built for him. He moved slowly, deliberately, not because he was old, he wasn't, but because he knew people would wait. He wore a charcoal gray suit with a pattern too subtle to name, and a gold pin on his lapel shaped like a rising sun. His shoes were polished to a shine that seemed out of place in the airport's scuffed, dull world. Sylvia recognized him the way people recognize faces they'd seen on screens. News segments, magazine covers, maybe a leadership conference advertisement in an airport lounge. Malcolm Rexton, media mogul, philanthropist, founder of the Rexton Equity Network, a man whose face carried weight, especially in certain circles. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Rexton," Sylvia said, stepping aside. He looked at her just long enough for the air to change. "I know where I'm going," he said. Not rude, not exactly. Just enough to set a tone. She watched him move down the aisle, settling into seat 2A without a glance at the overhead bin. The kind of man who traveled light because he expected the world to carry things for him. Sylvia returned to the front, brushing past Liam on his way in. "Big name on board," Liam murmured, jerking his chin toward first class. "I noticed," Sylvia replied, keeping her voice level. But something had shifted, not just in the air but in her posture. Her shoulders sat differently now, her steps more careful. As she began the pre-departure checks, her attention kept circling back to 2A. Malcolm had pulled out his phone and was tapping away, not looking up as passengers filed past. But when she moved to check seatbelts, he paused, not lifting his eyes but stopping his hands. "I'm sure you've got a protocol," he said calmly, "but I've flown enough miles to know how to click a buckle." Sylvia offered a polite nod. "It's just part of the safety procedure, sir." He gave a small huff of amusement. "Of course it is." No argument, no outright rudeness. But his tone landed somewhere between tired and testing. She'd seen that before. The subtle pull of power, the kind that didn't need volume to dominate a room. Liam caught her eye from across the galley. "Everything good?" he mouthed. Sylvia smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. By the time the final passengers were seated and the door closed with a heavy thud, she'd already decided to keep her distance. She didn't want to provoke anything. Didn't want to become a story someone told later on the ground. But peace doesn't always last in the sky. As she moved through the cabin with a tray of welcome drinks, Malcolm looked up. "No sparkling water?" he asked. "We have club soda, or I can get bottled still." He gave a slow shake of his head. "You'd think first class would know the difference." "I'll bring both," Sylvia said, keeping her tone light. She brought him the drinks. He took the club soda, stared at it a beat, then looked at her again. "Goldie," he said, just loud enough for her to hear. "What's your name?" She blinked. "Sylvia." He nodded as if filing it away. "Well, Sylvia, let's hope the rest of this flight lives up to expectations." She didn't reply. She didn't have to. But the comment sat with her long after she walked away. There was something about the way he said her name, like it was something he owned. Later, as the plane climbed into cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign dimmed, Sylvia stood in the galley, hands resting against the cool stainless steel of the countertop. Her fingers curled slightly, not clenched, not quite. She could still feel his eyes on her, not constantly, but just enough to make her aware of herself. She wasn't afraid, not exactly, but there was a weight to his presence, a pressure that crept in through the seams. And in that quiet, suspended space above the clouds, she realized something she hadn't felt in a long time. She was being watched, not as a professional, not as a human being, but as someone whose every move could be twisted, then turned into a test she hadn't signed up for. Sometimes the people with the brightest resumes cast the darkest shadows. And when they do, it takes more than politeness to stand in the light. The steady hum of the engines was usually comforting to Sylvia. It had a way of dulling the edge of things. Conversation, thoughts, the heaviness that sometimes built up in the spaces between service rounds. But today, it wasn't working. The sound only seemed to amplify what was going unsaid. She moved through the first-class cabin with practiced ease, offering drinks, answering small requests, smiling in that way flight attendants learn to do, even when something's off. Her body went through the motions, but her mind kept returning to seat 2A. Malcolm hadn't spoken again since calling her Goldie, but the memory of it echoed louder than it had any right to. Not the name itself, it wasn't even original, but the way he said it, like he was setting her place in the world without asking if she agreed. She reached his row again, this time to offer a warm towel. He didn't look up right away, just held out a hand, still reading something on his phone. She placed the towel gently in his palm, turned to go. "You got that look," he said suddenly. Sylvia paused, her back to him. She turned slowly. "I'm sorry." He leaned back, folding the towel over his fingers. That tight expression, like you're doing everything right but still waiting for someone to criticize you. I've seen it before. Her face stayed neutral. She'd been trained well. "I'm just focused on the service," she said. "Mm-hmm." He finally met her eyes. "Let me guess. You've been in this game about 8 years?" "9. Thought so." He nodded like he'd just proven something. That's the point where it starts to wear you down, when you've taken care of enough people to realize most don't see you at all. Sylvia didn't respond. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You think I don't know what it's like to be invisible? I built my name from nothing, and I didn't do it by staying silent or backing down when someone looked at me like I didn't belong." His tone wasn't angry. If anything, it sounded instructive, like he was doing her a favor. "I appreciate your insight, sir," Sylvia said, keeping her voice even. "Can I get you anything else?" He held her gaze for a beat longer, then shook his head. "Number, you've given me plenty." She walked away, her stomach twisting with something unfamiliar. It wasn't just irritation. It was confusion, discomfort, that strange feeling of being pulled into a conversation you hadn't agreed to have. Back in the galley, Liam was sorting dinner trays with a kind of casual precision that came from years of doing the job half asleep. "You okay?" he asked, not looking up. Sylvia hesitated before answering. "Just a little thrown. Passenger in 2A?" She didn't say anything, but Liam nodded like he already knew. "Yeah, I've served him before," he said. "Twice. Once he was charming. The other time I thought he was going to tear the galley apart because the salmon was overcooked." Sylvia leaned against the counter, arms folded. "Why does he talk like he's the one being attacked?" she asked quietly. "Like, I'm the threat." Liam looked up, expression softening. "Because that's how power holds on to itself," he said, "by pretending it's still fighting for survival." That sat heavy between them for a moment. Then Liam added, "Don't let him get in your head. You know who you are." Sylvia didn't answer. She appreciated the words, but they didn't settle. Something about Malcolm's presence scratched at the back of her mind. Not because of what he said, but because of what he seemed to believe. That his past gave him permission to walk through people in the present. She took a breath, straightened her shoulders, and went back out into the aisle. Most of the passengers had settled into their movies or books. The hum of the engines had returned to its usual rhythm. For a while, everything looked the way it should. But under that calm, she could feel it building, slow and steady. There was something brewing at 30,000 feet. And it wasn't turbulence. Not the kind that shakes your drink. The kind that tests your silence. Sometimes it's not what they say that wears you down. It's how they say it like they're doing you a favor while stepping on your dignity. Dinner service began without a hitch. The cabin lights dimmed just enough to give everything a golden sheen, soft and forgiving. The kind of lighting that made people feel more important than they were. Passengers settled in, unfolded their tray tables, and waited for their steak or pasta with a quiet kind of entitlement that Sylvia had long since learned to navigate. She worked quickly but attentively, checking each dish, glancing at each face, letting her voice drop to a gentler tone as she offered sauces and refills. It was a rhythm she knew well, efficient, gracious, invisible, until someone decided she shouldn't be. When she reached Malcolm Rexton's row again, his tray table was already down. He didn't look up as she placed the meal in front of him, but she caught the edge of a frown. "This was supposed to be medium rare," he said, poking at the steak with his fork. "It was plated as requested, sir," Sylvia replied calmly. "If it's not to your liking, I can have another one brought up." He glanced up at her, eyes sharp but not angry, just calculating. "You know," he said, "I'm used to being disappointed in places like this. They dress it up, call it first class, but the service always slips when you look like me." The words hit like a slap, not because they were loud, but because they were said just loud enough for the man in 3C to hear. Just enough to make Sylvia feel suddenly exposed. She took a slow breath. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Mr. Rexton. I've served every guest with the same level of care." Malcolm smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "Of course you have." The air felt tighter after that, not just around them, but in the whole cabin. Passengers kept eating, kept sipping their wine, but Sylvia could feel it, the way glances started lingering a little longer. The way a silence grew between rows, not obvious but heavy. She stepped back into the galley and leaned against the counter, her knuckles brushing the edge of the drawer. Liam was there again, unwrapping desserts, humming under his breath. She didn't speak right away. When she finally did, her voice was low. "He accused me of treating him differently because he's black." Liam paused, hand still. He didn't look surprised, just tired. "He always plays that card when he doesn't get what he wants," he said. "Doesn't mean his experience hasn't been real. Just, sometimes folks forget they're not the only ones fighting." Sylvia nodded slowly, unsure of how to hold the mix of emotions inside her. She wasn't angry, at least not yet. She was hurt. Not by the accusation itself, but by the assumption behind it. The idea that everything she was doing, everything she'd built her professional identity around, could be dismissed with one quiet jab. She stepped out again, passing by 3C, where an older black gentleman, dignified, composed, sat with his newspaper folded neatly on his lap. He caught her eye as she passed. "He says that kind of thing to you?" the man asked gently, voice low so no one else would hear. Sylvia paused, uncertain. "I didn't mean to eavesdrop," he added, "but I've known men like him. They wear the wounds of the past like armor, but sometimes that armor turns into a weapon." Sylvia swallowed hard. "What should I do?" she asked before she could stop herself. The man gave her a small, sad smile. "Do your job, and don't let his bitterness become yours." She nodded once and walked on. It was strange, how someone could make you feel like the floor beneath your feet was less solid. But it was also strange how a few quiet words from someone else could pull you back into place. Back in her jump seat, as the cabin quieted and the trays were cleared, Sylvia sat with her hands folded in her lap. She stared ahead, eyes fixed but unfocused, listening to the gentle clicks of buckles and murmurs of half-asleep passengers. She had always known there were battles in the air. Usually they were with turbulence, delays, overhead bins that wouldn't close. But sometimes they were quieter, more personal, and they didn't show up on radar. The following hour passed in that strange mid-flight hush. When conversations grew softer, lights dimmed, and the hum of the engines became the only constant in a suspended world. Sylvia moved through the cabin, checking tray tables and clearing dishes, careful with every gesture. Even the most routine movements felt loaded now, like they might be misread, twisted, turned into something they weren't. When she reached 2A, Malcolm didn't speak. He didn't have to. His silence came with a presence, like a challenge. Sylvia reached for his tray, but he kept one hand on the edge. "I'd like to keep the bread," he said, not looking at her. "Of course." She adjusted the items, slid the tray out smoothly and turned. "And next time," he added, "maybe don't rush to clear it. Some of us aren't used to being hurried off." There was no bite in his tone, just that same cold smoothness. The words slid in like a knife through butter, quiet but sharp. Sylvia felt the heat rise behind her ears, but she didn't turn back. She wouldn't give him that. Back in the galley, Connie, the flight's senior crew lead, was going over paperwork. She glanced up, raised an eyebrow. "You look tight," Connie said, her voice matter-of-fact. "Everything okay up front?" Sylvia hesitated, then spoke evenly. "Passenger in 2A is making a point of reminding me who he is." Connie exhaled slowly. "Malcolm Rexton?" Sylvia nodded. "Yeah, he's a regular. Used to be charming. Now it depends on what kind of day he's having." Connie stood up, smoothing her navy skirt. If it gets worse, let me know. But otherwise, just keep it professional. That word, professional. It always came up in situations like this, and Sylvia had come to understand what it really meant. Endure it. She didn't say anything, just nodded and turned away. The next service round went on without incident, until a passenger 2 rows ahead requested an extra blanket. Sylvia retrieved one from the overhead compartment and was walking back when Malcolm stopped her. "Excuse me," he said, voice low. "I asked for another club soda 15 minutes ago." Sylvia blinked. "I didn't receive that request, sir. I'll get it right away." His eyes narrowed. "You didn't receive it, or you ignored it?" Several passengers turned their heads at that. It wasn't a shout, but it cut through the quiet. "I wasn't aware of the request, sir," she said, her tone steady. "You see," Malcolm said, speaking not just to her now, but to the man beside him and the one across the aisle. "This is how it starts. The little things. The kind of service you get when people assume they don't owe you respect." Sylvia felt her chest tighten, not from embarrassment, but from the helplessness that came when someone twisted truth into weaponry. She knew she hadn't ignored him. She also knew that none of that mattered now. She moved swiftly back to the galley and poured a fresh club soda, her hands steady even as her jaw clenched. Liam stood nearby, arms folded. "He's trying to bait you," he said quietly. "I know," she whispered. "He does it to get a reaction, because the reaction proves his point." Sylvia nodded. "But if I stay quiet, it still proves his point." Liam didn't answer. There was no right move, and they both knew it. When she returned with the drink, Malcolm accepted it without a word. No thank you, no glance, just silence, thick and purposeful. From across the aisle, Otis Langford sat watching quietly, the same newspaper still resting in his lap. As Sylvia passed him, he gave her a nod, not of sympathy, but of recognition. The kind that says, "I see what's happening here." Back in her seat, Sylvia closed her eyes for a moment. Not to rest, just to shut out the gaze of a man who didn't want service. He wanted submission. And for the first time on this flight, she wasn't sure if she could stay quiet much longer. The next few minutes passed in fragments, small tasks, quiet nods, a handful of pleasantries exchanged with passengers who barely looked up from their screens. But Sylvia felt none of it. She moved like her body belonged to someone else, going through the motions while her mind spun in place. She stood in the galley, her back to the curtain, one hand braced on the counter, the other rubbing her temple. Liam had gone back to check on economy. Connie was speaking with the pilots over the intercom, confirming the descent schedule. And for a few short minutes, Sylvia was alone with her thoughts. She wasn't sure what hurt more, the accusation itself or the way no one questioned it. Malcolm had framed her as dismissive, maybe even biased, with nothing but a carefully timed comment and a steady gaze. And no one had stood up. No one had challenged him. Not the man next to him. Not the passenger across the aisle. Not even Connie. The silence, she realized, wasn't neutral. It was permission. She caught her own reflection in the metal cabinet door. Her lips were tight. Her jaw flexed. She didn't look angry. She looked erased. There was a rustle behind her. Otis Langford stood in the narrow doorway between the galley and the aisle, holding a paper cup. "I figured you could use a fresh coffee," he said simply, holding it out. Sylvia blinked at him. "That's not your job," he smiled. "Neither is watching a good person get run over. But here we are." She accepted the cup slowly, grateful more for the gesture than the caffeine. Otis leaned gently against the edge of the wall, voice low. "I've been watching him for the last hour. He's not here for a flight. He's here for a moment where he gets to prove a point. And you're the chosen example." Sylvia nodded once. "He thinks I see him as less than." Otis shook his head. "No, sweetheart. He wants you to see yourself as less than." That hit harder than she expected. "I don't want to make it worse," she murmured. "If I push back, it becomes a scene. And then I'm just the angry blonde who couldn't take criticism." Otis looked at her, steady and kind. "Do you know how many times I've kept quiet to keep peace that didn't include me?" Sylvia met his eyes. "And do you know how often I regretted it afterward?" The words hung in the small space between them, quiet but unshakable. Otis took a sip of his own coffee. then stepped back into the aisle, leaving her with the silence he'd just helped her fill. She looked down at the coffee in her hands, then out toward the curtain that separated her from the cabin. Malcolm hadn't said another word since the last exchange, but she could feel the weight of his presence. He didn't need to keep speaking. He'd planted something, and now he was just waiting to see what would grow. Sylvia set the cup down, straightened her jacket, and stepped back through the curtain. The cabin lights were low but not dark. A few passengers had pulled on sleep masks. Others scrolled through seatback screens. Everything looked calm, normal, but she knew better now. She walked down the aisle, not to Malcolm, not yet, but to Connie, who stood at row 6 checking seatbelt status. "I need to report a concern," Sylvia said softly, but clearly. Connie looked at her, surprised. "About what?" Sylvia took a breath. "About a pattern of targeted behavior by a passenger. It's not loud, it's not physical, but it's intentional." Connie stared at her for a long second. Then, to Sylvia's surprise, she nodded. "I saw it too," she said quietly. "I just didn't know what to call it." Sylvia nodded back. "Call it what it is. Manipulation." She didn't want to escalate things for revenge. This wasn't about pride. It was about the fact that if she stayed quiet, someone else, maybe a newer attendant, maybe someone without a Liam or an Otis nearby, would walk into the same pattern and blame themselves. She wasn't going to let that happen. Not this time. It's not always the volume of the insult that leaves the bruise. Sometimes it's the echo of no one stepping in to stop it. The cabin felt colder now, though the temperature hadn't changed. The shift wasn't in the air. It was in the way people carried themselves. Sylvia could sense it in the subtle glances over shoulders, the way conversations slowed as she passed. Even the rattle of an ice cube in a plastic cup seemed louder than it should have been. She knew what that meant. Word had spread, not through whispers or texts, but through posture. How people sat straighter when she walked by, how a few passengers avoided eye contact. Some were waiting to see if there'd be more drama. Others were trying to decide if they should pick a side. It wasn't new to her, but it still stung. As she stepped into the galley, Liam met her there, arms crossed loosely. "I heard," he said. "About the report?" she asked, pulling a fresh bottle of water from the drawer. Liam nodded. "Connie told me." There was no judgment in his tone. Only something else. Something like quiet relief. Sylvia set the bottle down and leaned against the wall. "I didn't do it to make a scene." "I know," Liam said. "You did it so someone else wouldn't have to." She appreciated that. Not just the words, but that he understood. He looked down at the floor for a second, then up at her again. "You know, I used to admire Rexton." Sylvia turned toward him. "He came to my college once, spoke at a panel about equity and entrepreneurship, said all the right things, about not letting society define your ceiling, about building your own table instead of waiting for a seat at theirs." Liam smiled faintly. "I remember walking out of that room feeling 10 feet tall." "What changed?" Sylvia asked. Liam's smile faded. "I interned for one of his media startups the summer after graduation, and I watched him humiliate a junior editor in a meeting because she corrected his numbers. Politely. She was right, by the way, but it didn't matter." He paused. She was white and young, and she reminded him of someone he once had to answer to. So he shut her down, publicly. Sylvia stayed quiet, letting the story settle between them. "I quit 2 weeks later," Liam said. "Took me longer to stop admiring him, though." They stood there for a long moment, the hum of the aircraft vibrating softly beneath their feet. It was a strange kind of grief, to lose respect for someone who had once inspired you. But it was also clarifying. Sylvia exhaled, more tired than she realized. "You think this'll go anywhere?" Liam shrugged. "Doesn't have to go far. It just has to go far enough to remind him that he doesn't get to rewrite the rules midair." Sylvia gave a small nod. She pulled the curtain aside, stepping back into the cabin. Clara Wynne, the sharp-eyed woman in seat 3D, flagged her down with a gentle wave. "I hope this isn't inappropriate," Clara said, her voice low and steady. "But I overheard some of the earlier interaction. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. He just wasn't being subtle." Sylvia tensed slightly, unsure of where this was going. I used to work at one of his companies, Clara continued, and I want you to know, you're not imagining any of this. Sylvia blinked. You knew him? Clara smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Enough to walk away from a six-figure contract. That surprised Sylvia more than she let on. Clara leaned in a little. If you need someone to back you up in that report, say the word. I'll be your witness. I'm not afraid of him. Sylvia looked at her. Really looked at her. The steel in Clara's voice wasn't forced. It wasn't performative. It was earned. Thank you, she said quietly but firmly. I just might. As she moved down the aisle, she passed Malcolm. He sat with his eyes closed, but she knew he wasn't sleeping. The muscles in his jaw gave him away. Tight, clenched like he was holding back words. Maybe anger. Maybe something else. She didn't pause. Didn't look at him. But something in the air between them shifted. Something that said, I'm not playing your game anymore. Some people wear their names like crowns. Others wear them like armor. But when they start using it as a weapon, it's time someone remembered how to take it away. The hours after dinner were always the calmest on a long-haul flight. Dimmed cabin lights, passengers dozing off or scrolling through screens, the occasional whisper from row to row. For most, it was a time to rest. But for Sylvia, it was the hardest part, because quiet didn't always mean peaceful. She moved through the cabin slowly now, not from exhaustion, but because every step felt heavier than it should. Her smile, though still there, had softened into something less polished, less for show and more for survival. Malcolm hadn't said anything else. Not since she filed the report, not since Clara offered to stand beside her. But the silence around him had changed. No longer the heavy, looming kind. It was tighter, sharper, like a drawn wire waiting to snap. And though he didn't speak, he watched. Every time she walked by, she could feel it. From behind his closed eyelids, from under his breath, from behind the stillness, he watched. She passed his seat once more with the tea service. But this time, his voice stopped her cold. Funny thing about people, he said quietly. You give them a little authority, and they start thinking it makes them righteous. Sylvia didn't look at him. Is there something you need, Mr. Rexton? He opened his eyes and turned toward her, his gaze slow and measured. Number, but you seem to think you do. She stayed where she was, holding the tray steady in her hands. I did my job, she said softly. And you made sure everyone saw you do it, Malcolm replied, leaning back in his seat. Congratulations. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, I didn't do it to be seen. I did it so the next person wouldn't have to keep their head down to stay safe. Malcolm gave a dry laugh. Spare me the crusade. But there was something behind his voice now, a tremor, not of fear, of pride cracking, just a little. Sylvia didn't press. She didn't need to. Sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was stand without stepping forward. She walked away without another word. Near the galley, Clara caught her again as she passed. I sent a message, she whispered, to my editor. Told them I'm writing a piece, not just about him, but about the pattern, the silence that lets it happen. Sylvia raised an eyebrow. You think they'll run it? Clara nodded. I know they will. There was no thrill in her voice, no vengeance, just certainty, like someone who'd waited long enough to stop asking for permission. Back in the jump seat, Liam returned from economy. He sat across from her, buckling in. How's the cabin? He asked. Quiet, she said. Too quiet? She nodded once. The kind that holds its breath. Liam looked at her for a moment, then spoke low. You did something bigger than filing a report. You broke a rhythm. People like him, they build routines. They count on people swallowing it. Sylvia leaned her head against the bulkhead. I didn't plan to be the one to stop it. No one ever does. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The cabin light blinked once, signaling final approach was near. Soon the passengers would stir, stretch, gather their belongings. The world below would return with its rush of movement and noise. But up here, above it all, truth moved slower, quiet but firm. Sylvia adjusted her posture and closed her eyes for just a moment, not to sleep, but to mark the moment. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel victorious, but she felt certain that had to be enough. Sometimes the loudest changes happen in silence, in a glance returned, in a step not taken back, in a voice that chooses to speak even when it shakes. The fasten seatbelt sign lit up with a gentle chime. It was the kind of cue most passengers responded to automatically, shifting in their seats, closing tray tables, tugging on straps. But for Sylvia, it signaled something else entirely. This wasn't just the start of descent. It was the beginning of something she couldn't take back. She stood near the front galley, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear as the intercom crackled. The captain's voice filled the cabin, smooth and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Quinn. We're beginning our descent into New York's JFK Airport. Weather on the ground is clear, and we expect a smooth approach. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened as we prepare for landing." Zariah Quinn's voice was familiar to Sylvia, sharp when needed, calm by nature. It was the kind of voice passengers trusted, and so did Sylvia. Minutes later, just as the aircraft leveled slightly in its downward glide, the cockpit door opened. Zariah stepped into the cabin, not for a bathroom break, not for a stretch. She walked with quiet intent toward the front row, and the moment she stopped beside seat 2A, the air shifted. Malcolm looked up, just barely, his expression unreadable. The cabin around them hushed. Even the sound of the engines seemed to fade for a beat. "Mr. Rexton," Zariah said, her voice low but audible, "a formal report has been filed regarding your behavior on this flight. It has been documented by the crew and will be reviewed immediately upon landing." Malcolm blinked, but said nothing. Zariah's eyes didn't leave his. "You've been flagged before, sir, but this time there are witnesses, and this time someone didn't let it slide." He finally spoke, his voice dry. "You're stepping out of your place, Captain." Zariah didn't flinch. "No, sir, I'm stepping into it." There were no raised voices, no accusations, just stillness, so thick it was almost physical. Sylvia stood nearby, watching it all, not for validation, not for revenge, but for something quieter, confirmation that the system she served had not entirely forgotten how to stand. Zariah turned to Sylvia and gave a single nod. Not grand, not performative. Just enough to say, "I see you." Then she returned to the cockpit, the door clicking shut behind her. Malcolm sat back in his seat, jaw tight. His fingers drummed once against the armrest, then stopped. From across the aisle, Otis Langford adjusted his glasses and flipped the page of his newspaper. He didn't look up, didn't smirk, but the timing was pointed. Sylvia returned to her seat for landing, the hum of the plane now layered with something else. An energy she couldn't quite name. It wasn't relief, not yet, but it was close. As the nose of the plane dipped slightly and the city lights below began to glow, she took a breath that felt a little fuller, a little freer. It was nearly over, but not really, because when someone like Malcolm was held accountable, even in the smallest way, it didn't just end with the wheels on the ground. It started there. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. It speaks once, clearly, and leaves enough silence afterward for the truth to echo. The lights of New York twinkled beneath them like spilled stars as the plane continued its descent. In the cabin, the atmosphere had changed, not in volume, but in tone. People sat a little stiffer. A few exchanged glances. One woman clutched her handbag tighter in her lap, though there was no threat in sight. Sylvia sat in her jump seat, facing the cabin. Her hands rested on her thighs, steady but alert. She wasn't thinking about turbulence or tray tables anymore. She was thinking about how fast things had turned. She'd done her job. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't lost her composure. But she'd said enough to interrupt the script people like Malcolm Rexton were used to reciting. And now, as they floated above the last few thousand feet of altitude, she could feel the weight of that choice. Across the aisle, Malcolm stared forward, unmoving. He hadn't said another word since Zariah spoke to him. But his silence felt different now. Less like control, more like calculation. When the wheels finally touched down, there was a soft thud. Clean, smooth, exactly how a landing should feel. A few passengers clapped lightly, out of habit more than celebration. Others stirred from their half-naps, stretching and twisting their necks. But Sylvia kept her eyes on Malcolm, not as a warning, not out of fear, because something in her told her he was still waiting for a moment. still expecting one last opportunity to reframe the story. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers rose like a slow wave, reaching for bags, whispering to one another. Sylvia unbuckled and stood, stepping toward the front, ready to assist with deplaning. Malcolm rose from his seat, briefcase in hand, and stepped into the aisle. When he reached Sylvia, he stopped. Not for long, just long enough to create another moment. "I hope," he said, his voice lower now, "that whatever satisfaction you got from this was worth it." Sylvia met his eyes. "It wasn't about satisfaction," she replied. "It was about stopping a pattern." He scoffed, barely audible. "You think you made a dent?" "I think I stopped being afraid to try." There was no applause, no gasps, just a breath, a pause in the space between them. Behind Malcolm, Clara Wynne stepped forward with her carry-on and gently interrupted. "Excuse me, sir." Malcolm glanced back, surprised to see her. "I'll be quoting this flight in my article," she said, voice light but firm. "Just so you know." He gave her a tight-lipped smile. "I'm sure you will." Then he walked off the aircraft without another word. Clara turned to Sylvia. "Still want me to be your witness?" Sylvia smiled. "You already are." As the last few passengers filed out, Liam stepped into the galley with a clipboard in hand. "Security rep is waiting outside the jet bridge," he said. "Zariah logged the report herself." Sylvia nodded. "She didn't have to." "But she did," Liam said, tapping the clipboard against his palm. "And that matters." It did, not because it solved everything, but because it marked something. A line. A moment someone said, "This far," and no further. Sylvia turned to look back at the now empty first-class cabin. The seats were pristine again, quiet. No trace of what had happened lingered in the fabric or the walls, but she felt it, and she knew others had too. Some would walk away pretending nothing had changed, but some would remember exactly how it felt when power didn't get to land the way it always had. Sometimes the strongest landings don't shake the plane. They shift the ground it stands on. The cabin was empty now. All passengers had disembarked, and the soft echo of rolling luggage had faded beyond the jet bridge. But Sylvia remained still, standing in the front galley, with her hands resting on the edge of the counter. The plane, though quiet, still buzzed faintly under her shoes, its systems powering down, its heart still beating just beneath the surface. She didn't rush to grab her bag. She didn't peel off her blazer like she usually did after landing. Something about the moment felt heavier than routine. Liam stepped in from the aisle, his clipboard finally tucked under his arm. He looked at her for a long second. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, but slowly. "I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't this." "You expected more noise?" he asked. "Maybe," she said. "Or less clarity." Liam smiled faintly. "Funny how clarity feels like static the first time you hear it." He leaned against the galley wall and crossed his arms. "Security rep said Rexton didn't say a word to them, just handed over his ID, confirmed the report, and walked out like he was headed to a meeting." "That tracks," Sylvia said, not surprised. "He's not the kind of man who shows cracks. He lets other people trip on the ones he made." They stood quietly for a moment, both listening to the gentle clicks of the plane settling into stillness. Then Liam said something she hadn't expected. "Zariah told me she had a file on him already. Quiet complaints, people who never followed through, a pattern with flight staff." Sylvia turned to him. "She said this was the first one anyone formalized." Sylvia exhaled through her nose. Not relief exactly, but something close. Not because she'd wanted to be the first, but because it meant she hadn't imagined it, that there had been a thread all along. She'd just been the one to finally pull it. Outside the aircraft door, Connie appeared with her usual clipboard, in her usual brisk energy. But this time, she looked different. Slower, maybe. Thoughtful. "I signed off on the incident report," Connie said. "Just confirming it with you." Sylvia nodded. "Thank you." Connie hesitated. "I should have said something earlier. I saw how he was speaking to you. I just didn't want to make it worse." Sylvia didn't scold her. She didn't smile it away either. Instead, she said gently, "Silence is how it stays worse." Connie nodded, her face coloring just slightly. Then she gave a short, quiet sigh. You handled it better than I would have. I don't know if I handled it, Sylvia said. I just didn't back away. When they finally began to disembark themselves, walking the narrow hallway to the terminal, Sylvia felt the weight of the last few hours settle somewhere behind her ribs. Not as pressure, but as space. Like something she'd been carrying for too long had finally made room for something new. Liam walked beside her, his steps relaxed. You know, you didn't just protect yourself up there, he said. She looked at him. You showed people what it looks like when someone chooses to interrupt the script. Sylvia didn't say anything at first, just nodded. As they passed through the door and into the quiet of the terminal, a thought crossed her mind. Not sharp, not urgent, just clear. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't fought fire with fire. She'd done her job, and this time it had been enough to shift something real. When stillness follows a storm, it doesn't mean the sky has forgotten. It means someone stood up long enough to calm the wind. The crew lounge at JFK was dim, with low lighting and worn leather chairs that carried the scent of tired uniforms and too much coffee. It wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet, and tonight Sylvia needed quiet more than anything. She sat near the window, still in uniform, though her blazer was folded neatly beside her. Outside, another ether-jet plane rolled into view, its landing lights glowing like tired eyes. She watched the ground crew swarm around it, like ants with purpose, every motion fluid and familiar. Her phone buzzed softly against the armrest, a text from her mother. Just checking in. Call when you're rested. Love you. She stared at the screen for a second before locking it again. She wasn't ready to talk about tonight yet. Not out loud, not even with someone who'd listen without asking questions. Liam entered a moment later, carrying 2 paper cups and a small chocolate bar balanced between them. You look like someone who could use sugar, he said. Sylvia smiled tiredly. You're not wrong. He handed her the cup. It was lukewarm terminal coffee, but it tasted better than it should have. They've grounded Rexton's account, he said after a pause. Temporarily. Sylvia's eyes lifted. Already? Zariah didn't waste time. Said the internal system flagged him the second your report was uploaded. She made sure it wasn't buried. Sylvia took another sip. Is that permanent? Not yet, Liam said. But if anyone from corporate interviews Clara or Otis, my guess is he won't be flying with us again. She nodded slowly, processing that. Not because she wanted revenge, but because consequences mattered. They were how things changed. He'll spin it, she said after a moment, to his audience. Make it sound like he was targeted, misunderstood. Maybe, Liam said, but some stories don't belong to the ones who shout the loudest. Sylvia turned to him, grateful for his steadiness. How do you do that? Keep perspective? Liam shrugged. I've been doing this longer than you, and I've seen enough to know that sometimes we win by outlasting the narrative. They fell into silence again, comfortable this time. Then Liam added more gently, You know, Clara already sent her editor a summary. She said she didn't name you directly, but she made it clear what happened. Sylvia wasn't sure how she felt about that, but somewhere inside her, a small part relaxed. Not because she wanted to be the center of a headline, but because the truth deserved to have legs. She reached for the chocolate bar, unwrapped it halfway, and broke off a square. You think he'll read it? She asked. Liam grinned. Oh, he'll read it. Men like him always read what's said about them, even when they pretend not to. Sylvia leaned back in the chair, the bitter sweetness of dark chocolate grounding her more than the coffee ever could. Do you think it'll matter to him? She asked quietly. Liam didn't answer right away. Then, I think it'll matter that it happened, that someone didn't look away, that someone said, enough. Whether he cares or not, that's not your job to carry. She let those words settle. Let them find a place somewhere between her ribs and her spine. Outside, a new set of passengers filed toward the gate. Another flight, another crew, another round of smiles, instructions, and carrying the weight of expectations that rarely made room for mistakes. But tonight, Sylvia had shifted something. Not just on the manifest, not just in policy, but in the quiet ledger that lives in every place where power is used like a shield instead of a gift. Some victories don't come with applause. They come with clarity, with knowing you didn't let silence win when the weight of it pressed hardest. By the time Sylvia stepped out of the terminal, the city had wrapped itself in a curtain of dusk. The air was crisp, cooler than it had been in Atlanta that morning, and carried the faint scent of exhaust, concrete, and something sweet from the pretzel stand down by baggage claim. She adjusted the strap on her bag and started walking toward the exit, heels clicking softly against the tile. Each step carried a kind of finality, not dramatic, just firm, grounded. She hadn't said everything she wanted to say, but she'd said enough. Ahead of her, near the rideshare pickup zone, she spotted a familiar profile. Malcolm Rexton. He stood alone near the curb, suitcase beside him, phone in one hand. Not talking, just scrolling. His expression was unreadable, but the energy around him had shifted. That smooth, calculating control he wore like a second skin looked unsettled. Not broken, but chipped. Sylvia considered walking past him without a word, just leaving the moment as it was, unfinished and clean. But something in her paused, not out of pettiness, not even out of defiance, just clarity. She stopped a few feet away, far enough to give him space, close enough that he'd have to acknowledge her if he looked up. He did. There was a flicker in his face, just a second of recognition, then the same guarded expression he'd worn the entire flight. "You following me now?" he asked dryly. "No," Sylvia said calmly. "Just walking out the same door." He stared at her, silent. She continued, her voice quiet. "You know, you almost had me convinced." He blinked. "Convinced of what?" "That I was the one who needed to question myself." Malcolm exhaled through his nose. "You still think this was about you?" "It was," she replied. "Not just me, but people like me. People who get run over because someone carries the weight of their own past like a weapon." He shook his head slowly. "You have no idea what I've carried." "I don't," Sylvia admitted, "but I do know what you dropped on me mid-flight, and it wasn't mine to carry." There was no raised voice, no crowd to witness. Just the two of them, under a muted airport sky, surrounded by the sound of rolling suitcases and the occasional car horn. Malcolm's jaw tightened. He looked away, then back. "You think filing a report and tossing a few dramatic quotes to the press makes you right?" "No," she said, stepping back toward the sidewalk. "I think it makes me responsible." His face didn't move, but his hands, Sylvia noticed, shifted slightly, one curling tighter around the handle of his suitcase. She didn't need to say anything else. She didn't need him to apologize. The silence was enough. It held the shape of everything he wasn't willing to admit, and everything she didn't need permission to know. As she turned to leave, Otis Langford emerged from the terminal behind her, his coat now draped over one arm. He spotted Malcolm and gave him a brief, level nod. Not friendly, not cruel. Just final. Then he caught up to Sylvia. "You good?" he asked, matching her stride. "I'm getting there." "Yeah," Otis said, chuckling faintly. "You arrived a while ago. Just took a minute to notice." They walked side by side toward the taxi line, leaving behind the terminal, the long day, and the man who had once assumed he could bend the air around him with a glance. Sometimes checkmate doesn't come with a king falling. It comes with the silence of someone realizing they're out of moves, and no one's looking to crown them again. The hotel was quiet, the kind of quiet Sylvia had grown to appreciate. No lobby music, no bustling groups in matching t-shirts. Just a late-night receptionist nodding hello, and the soft echo of suitcase wheels on polished floors. She took the elevator to the 11th floor, her shoulders beginning to relax only after the doors closed. There was something sacred about these moments. After the passengers, after the crew, after the flight had released her back into her own skin. Her room was simple, neat. A beige comforter, a modest desk, the distant hum of traffic muffled by thick curtains. She sat on the edge of the bed without turning on the TV, without opening her suitcase. Just sat. The adrenaline had finally faded. What replaced it wasn't peace, at least not yet. It was a kind of quiet certainty, a full-body acknowledgement that something had changed. She didn't need to relive every moment with Malcolm. She didn't need to pull apart his words or reanalyze her own reactions. The pieces had landed. They were where they were meant to be. Her phone vibrated on the nightstand. It was a message from Zariah Quinn. Reviewed your statement. Added my own. Corporate's aware. You weren't alone, Sylvia. You were just the first to name it. Sylvia read the words twice, then once more, slowly, not because she didn't believe them, but because she did, and they felt heavier than she expected. She replied with two simple words, "Thank you," then set the phone down and walked to the window. From the 11th floor, the city looked different, like it was breathing. Yellow taxis blinked between traffic lights, shadows stretched across buildings like a quiet lullaby, and far in the distance, a plane traced a slow arc across the sky. She wondered if it was one of theirs. She wondered who was in 2A. A knock came at the door, soft but firm. When she opened it, she found Clara Wynne standing in the hallway, a takeout bag in one hand and two sodas tucked under her arm. "I figured you hadn't eaten anything real," Clara said with a shrug, "and I know hotel vending machines are a lie." Sylvia blinked, then stepped aside with a laugh. "Come in." They sat on the bed with boxes of noodles and the kind of easy quiet that follows people who've been through something together. Not trauma, exactly, but truth. Clara took a long sip of soda, then glanced at her. "You know, he's already trying to spin it." Sylvia raised an eyebrow. "That didn't take long." "Nope," Clara said. "He's calling it a misunderstanding about tone. Says he was misinterpreted by someone unfamiliar with his communication style." Sylvia snorted. "Let me guess. He released a statement?" "Posted a video," Clara said dryly, "from a private car, with jazz playing softly in the background." Sylvia shook her head. "Classic." "But here's the thing," Clara continued, eyes narrowing with a smile. "The comments aren't going the way he planned. People are tired of the performance. They're starting to recognize the pattern." Sylvia poked at her noodles. "It's not about ruining him." "I know," Clara said. "It's about making sure the next person he targets doesn't feel crazy when it happens." They ate in silence for a few minutes. Then Sylvia asked softly, "Do you think it'll last?" "The change?" Clara looked thoughtful. "I think people remember when someone finally says what they were all thinking, and I think you just gave them permission." Sylvia didn't respond right away. Instead, she glanced toward the window again. The night was still out there, unbothered, unmoved. But in the air, something had shifted. Not a storm, not a riot, just a current, slow, steady, real. The loudest power doesn't come from shouting. It comes from standing, quietly, steadily, when someone thought you'd shrink, and staying there long enough for others to join you. Morning came without ceremony. The hotel room was soaked in that pale, early light that made everything look softer than it really was. Wrinkled uniforms on the chair, half-drunk soda cans on the nightstand, and a pair of black flats still sitting by the door like they hadn't walked through fire the day before. Sylvia stood at the sink, brushing her teeth slowly, staring at her reflection. She didn't look any different. Maybe that's what struck her most. The world had shifted in some small but permanent way, and yet same face, same uniform, same quiet ache in her lower back. But inside, something had cleared. There was a knock at her door around 7:30. She opened it to find Connie, not in uniform, dressed casually, a clipboard under one arm and a hotel mug in hand. "Morning," Connie said. "You decent?" Sylvia stepped aside with a tired smile. "Barely." Connie walked in and perched on the desk chair. She looked like someone who had replayed 100 conversations in her head and still wasn't sure where to start. "I got a call from HR this morning," she said. "They confirmed the internal report is being escalated. Zariah signed it. So did the union rep." Sylvia sat on the edge of the bed, tying her shoes slowly. "Good. They're requesting statements from witnesses. Liam already submitted his. Otis Langford emailed his last night. Clara, too." Sylvia looked up. "That fast?" "Yeah," Connie said. "Apparently everyone had the same idea. This time it matters." She paused, then added more quietly, "I'm submitting mine after this." Sylvia waited. Connie looked down at the floor for a second, then met her gaze again. "I should have said something on the flight," she said. "I knew he was manipulating the situation. I've seen it before. Just not that clean." Sylvia shook her head gently. "You were doing your job." "No," Connie replied. I was protecting my comfort. There's a difference. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was honest. Then Connie leaned forward a little, resting her elbows on her knees. You know what stuck with me the most? She asked. It wasn't what he said. It was how calm you stayed. Not passive, not polite, just rooted. Sylvia shrugged faintly. I didn't feel calm. But you made the rest of us see the truth, Connie said. That takes something bigger than calm. Sylvia wasn't sure what to say to that. She didn't think of herself as brave. She hadn't set out to make a point. She just reached a limit. Connie stood, smoothing her shirt. They're meeting with Rexton next week, she said. Formal review. No more soft warnings. Sylvia nodded. Do you think anything will come of it? Connie gave her a long look. The man built his whole image on being unshakable. But yesterday you made him flinch. That alone? That's more than most. After she left, Sylvia sat quietly for a moment, then reached for her phone. There was a message waiting. This time, from someone unexpected. It was from Malcolm Rexton's public relations office. Ms. Dorn, Mr. Rexton is preparing a formal response to recent media inquiries and internal reports. As a courtesy, we wanted to extend an invitation to discuss your experience with him directly before any public statements are made. She stared at the screen, not in disbelief, but in understanding. This was the pivot, the cleanup, the attempt to shape the story before it shaped him. She didn't respond. She didn't delete it either. Instead, she stood, rolled her shoulders back, and picked up her blazer. Because some stories don't need a response. They just need to be believed. When power finally has to explain itself, it knocks quietly, hoping the door still opens. But some doors close for good, and the silence behind them, that's the sound of dignity, resting. Sylvia stepped off the hotel shuttle that afternoon, with the sun warming her face, and something in her chest that didn't feel like tension for once. The crew terminal at JFK was buzzing with its usual rhythm, pilots rolling their bags with quiet confidence, flight attendants in various stages of pre-flight routine, and those tiny passing nods of acknowledgement shared between professionals who understood what it meant to carry calm through chaos. She walked through the sliding glass doors, her badge clipped, her shoes polished. Everything looked the same, but something inside her had rearranged. There was no formal debrief scheduled today, no disciplinary meeting, no hearing, no press event. Just a flight, a standard route to Dallas, with a 4-hour layover and an overnight return. Routine, predictable, and yet. As she passed through security, Sylvia caught sight of a younger crew member, barely mid-20s, eyes alert but uncertain. The girl was fumbling with her badge, looking back and forth between terminals, clearly trying not to look lost. Sylvia stopped. New rotation? She asked with a soft smile. The girl blinked. Yeah, first week. Gates rotate fast at JFK, Sylvia said. Come on, I'll walk you there. They moved together down the long corridor, the girl relaxing just a little, her steps falling into rhythm beside Sylvia's. You always this calm? The girl asked. Sylvia chuckled, shaking her head. Not even close. I've just learned when not to waste energy. The girl smiled. They told us in training that first class can be intense. It can, Sylvia said, but it's not about the cabin. It's about the people. Some carry power like a gift, others like a sword. The girl looked at her sideways. What do you carry? Sylvia thought for a moment before answering. Perspective. They reached the gate and Sylvia paused before parting ways. If someone ever makes you question your worth, remember this. Your job is to keep people safe, not to shrink yourself to make them comfortable. The girl nodded slowly, the words landing. As Sylvia turned and walked toward her own gate, she felt her phone buzz. She didn't check it right away. She didn't need to. Somewhere behind her, the story was still being told. Clara's article had gone live that morning. Liam had texted her a screenshot. The headline was simple, but sharp. What happens when first class expects you to stay silent? It was making rounds quietly, steadily. A ripple moving through an industry used to still water. But Sylvia wasn't waiting for applause. She wasn't checking comment sections or hoping for recognition. She'd done what mattered, not just by reporting what happened, but by refusing to carry someone else's weight for them, by standing steady when the moment tried to twist her, by staying rooted in who she was. As the gate agent scanned her badge, Sylvia stepped into the jet bridge with the familiar hum of recirculated air and the scent of coffee warming in the galley. A new flight, a new set of faces, a new chance to walk through her work with integrity, the kind of arrival that didn't need an audience, only the right kind of quiet. Not all landings come with applause. Some come with the steady breath of someone who chose, at last, not to shrink, and realized the world didn't end when she stood tall. It just got a little quieter, a little better, and a whole lot clearer. Some stories aren't about dramatic showdowns or public reckonings. Sometimes they're about the quiet courage it takes to say, enough, and the quiet strength to stand firm when it's easier to look away. Sylvia didn't need to win a fight. She needed to be heard, and she was. And maybe that's the real victory. When dignity doesn't ask for permission, it just shows up and stays. Have you ever found yourself in a moment where silence felt safer, but your truth demanded more? We'd love to hear your story in the comments. And if this one moved you, challenged you, or reminded you of someone who stood tall in their own way, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. There are more powerful human stories just ahead.